Emily Hayes had been running away for months, not from a person, but from the memory of a life she had been forced to abandon, a life full of hope, purpose, and ambition. After her brother's death in combat, the world she knew had crumbled. The dream of becoming a veterinarian seemed a distant echo, as though it belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed. Grief, heavy and unyielding, had dragged her into the wilds of rural Montana, away from the bustling noise of cities and people who would only ask about the pain she had yet to process. The rolling hills of the Montana countryside had been her sanctuary, her retreat. The long hikes along isolated riverbanks were her escape. Here, she could be alone with the wind in her hair, the sound of birdsong in her ears, and nothing to remind her of the life she used to lead. But today was different. It was early fall. The air was crisp, the sky cloudless, and the sunlight filtered through the thinning trees, casting long shadows on the ground. Emily had been walking for hours, letting the rhythmic crunch of boots against dirt soothe her racing thoughts. She'd planned this trip, just like all the others. No expectations, no distractions, no emotions. Just a woman in the wilderness, trying to outrun the ache inside. But as she rounded the bend of the river, something in the air shifted. The familiar scents of pine and damp earth were overshadowed by something metallic, something rancid. At first, she thought it was the remains of some animal carcass, but as she moved closer, the stench grew worse. Her stomach twisted, and she almost turned back, but a strange compulsion tugged at her feet, pulling her forward into the brush. She couldn't explain why she pushed on, but the need to investigate was overpowering. Maybe it was the isolation of the woods. Maybe it was the curiosity she hadn't let herself feel in months. Or maybe it was a deeper instinct that whispered, "Go." She pushed through the undergrowth, brushing past tall grasses and overhanging branches until she reached the clearing. The sight that met her eyes was nothing short of horrifying. Lining the edges of the field were 6 German shepherds, their bodies limp and barely moving. Some were lying in the dirt, others were propped up weakly against trees or the remnants of broken fencing. Their fur was matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. The unmistakable scent of something toxic lingered in the air, and the dog's glazed eyes confirmed it. They were poisoned. Emily's heart raced as she stepped closer, each breath feeling heavier. These weren't just any dogs. They were survivors, weak, battered, and clearly neglected. The sight of them sent a sharp, biting pain straight to her chest. How could anyone do this to them? How could someone leave them to die in such a desolate place, far from civilization? Her instincts kicked in, the training she had abandoned for so long suddenly rushing back. But as she knelt down beside the nearest dog, a faint whimper escaped its lips and Emily's heart broke. The dog was still alive, but barely. Its breathing was shallow, its body trembling with the faintest sign of life. "Hey," she whispered softly, her voice trembling as much as the dog's body. "I'm gonna help you." The words felt absurd. How could she help? She had nothing but her backpack, and the medical supplies inside it were meant for herself, not for saving dying animals. But there was no time to waste. She couldn't leave them here, not like this. Her mind raced as she quickly assessed the situation. The dogs were dehydrated, some were malnourished, and all appeared to have been poisoned. Emily pulled her backpack off her shoulders and rifled through it, praying that she had something, anything that could help. A bottle of water, some granola bars, a few bandages. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. With trembling hands, she began to work. She didn't know how long it would take, or how many of them would survive. But she wasn't going to give up. She poured the water into the mouth of the closest dog, coaxing it to drink. Its eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of recognition. She moved to the next dog, then the next, methodically working her way through the small pack of suffering animals. Hours passed, though it felt like no time at all. Emily worked through the pain, through the exhaustion, trying to remember everything she'd learned in vet school. Even though it felt like a lifetime ago, she had seen death before, on the battlefield, in the clinic, but this was different. These animals had been betrayed, left to die in silence, with no one to care for them. As the night began to fall, Emily had done all she could. 2 of the dogs had died in her arms, their bodies too far gone to save. She mourned them quietly, no tears left to shed, just a deep, aching sorrow for lives lost too soon. But the other 4, Scout, Luna, Odin, Blaze, and Willow, were still alive. Breathing, their eyes following her every movement, Emily knew that she had to get them out of there, get them to safety. Her small cabin was only a few miles away, but she wasn't sure if any of them were strong enough to make the journey. "Come on," she whispered, gathering the survivors together. "We're going home." Emily's hands were shaking as she gently lifted one of the surviving dogs, Luna, into her arms. The German Shepherd's head rested against her chest, and Emily could feel the faintest flutter of breath as she cradled her. The dog was alive, but barely. The other dogs, Scout, Odin, Blaze, Willow, and Tank, were struggling, some standing weakly on trembling legs while others collapsed in exhaustion. They were all in different stages of distress, but Emily had no choice. They needed to get out of the woods, and fast. The last thing she remembered before this moment was the endless miles of woods she had hiked to escape the world. Now, it felt like the very woods were conspiring against her. Every step she took felt heavier, the weight of the dogs in her arms pulling her down. Her legs ached. Her body screamed for rest, but there was no time for that. The dogs needed her, and she wouldn't leave them behind. She moved as quickly as she could, her pace slowed by the dogs' conditions and the rough terrain. The sun was beginning to set, and the sky was streaked with pink and orange. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, not just from the physical exertion, but from the fear that the dogs wouldn't make it through the night. She hadn't even begun to treat their injuries fully. There were so many unknowns, so much left to do. She couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. After what felt like an eternity, Emily reached her cabin. She breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. The dogs were still weak, and she had no real facilities here to care for them. Her cabin was small, simple, and made for one person, not a pack of injured animals. She kicked open the door with her foot and quickly ushered the dogs inside. The small space was cluttered with her hiking gear, a few books, and basic survival supplies, but it was warm. The first thing Emily did was pour water into a metal bowl and place it in front of each dog. They lapped it up hungrily, their eyes still glazed with confusion, but there was a spark of life in each of them. She could see it now, the faintest flicker of trust. They knew she was trying to help. That thought kept her going. Emily wasted no time. She immediately got to work, setting up makeshift beds on the floor, using blankets and towels from her small linen closet. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She laid each dog on their own bed and began to administer the little medical aid she had on hand. A few bandages, some antiseptic. Most importantly, she began hydrating them, one by one, as best as she could. Luna, the one she'd carried the farthest, was the most fragile. Her breathing was shallow, and her body felt too warm, feverish to the touch. Emily gently coaxed her to drink more water, but she wasn't sure it was enough. The dog's body was so frail, every movement a strain on her. "I'm going to keep you safe," Emily whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I won't let you die like this." As the hours passed, Emily worked tirelessly to care for the dogs. She didn't sleep, didn't rest. There was no time for that. Each dog needed attention, and she had to make sure none of them slipped away. She used her limited resources to their fullest. Her old knowledge from vet school rushed back like a tidal wave, but it still felt so foreign, so distant. The dogs needed more than she could give, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt the familiar sting of failure. By the time the moon hung high in the sky, Emily had done all she could. 2 of the dogs had died, Tank and Willow, no longer able to fight. Emily had cradled them in her arms, whispering apologies she didn't know how to say. The grief felt too heavy. She had failed them, and she knew it. But there was still hope for the others. Scout, Odin, Blaze, and Luna had survived the night. Her body was exhausted, her mind spinning with uncertainty, but she couldn't give up now. She had made a promise to them, a promise that felt like the only thing she could hold on to. The animal's survival, her survival, depended on her getting it right. For the next few days, Emily's routine was consumed by the dogs. She fed them, gave them water, and made sure they were as comfortable as possible. It was a delicate balance of hope and fear. Every time one of the dogs showed signs of improvement, Emily felt a flicker of hope. But when they struggled to rise, when their movements became sluggish again, her heart sank. Odin was the first to show signs of improvement. After 2 days of barely moving, he finally raised his head to look at her, his eyes no longer foggy with pain. Slowly, he stood and took a few hesitant steps. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Emily couldn't help but smile. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Blaze followed soon after. His eyes, once dull, began to brighten, and though his movements were still slow and shaky, there was something undeniably strong about his presence. He was a fighter. Emily saw it in the way he sat up straighter each day, as if drawing strength from some unknown source. Luna and Scout, though still fragile, made progress as well. They were quieter than the others, their eyes reflecting the pain they'd endured, but Emily could see the flicker of hope in their gaze as they started to trust her more. The bond between them was growing, mutual healing, unspoken, but strong. One morning, Emily woke up to find the dogs sitting by the door, their eyes trained on her, waiting for her to begin her daily routine. There was something comforting in the sight, something grounding. For the first time in months, she didn't feel so alone. These dogs, though they had their scars, were survivors, and so was she. With the early morning light filtering through the window, Emily sat on the floor beside them, her heart swelling with emotion. It wasn't just the dogs who were healing. She was healing too. But deep down, Emily knew this was only the beginning. She hadn't just rescued them, she had started a journey that would change everything. Emily's small cabin, once a sanctuary from the grief that had followed her for so long, had become something else entirely. A makeshift home for 6 wounded souls. With the death of Tank and Willow, only 4 dogs remained, but each one seemed determined to survive. Scout, Odin, Blaze, and Luna were no longer the listless, broken creatures Emily had found in the woods. They were fighters, slowly but surely starting to recover. Emily could feel the transformation in them, and it was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. The first few days had been filled with panic and exhaustion, but now Emily was beginning to find a rhythm. Her days revolved around caring for the dogs. She had learned to give each of them the attention they needed, and she had already begun to notice the personalities emerging from the shadows of their trauma. Scout, the one with the darkest fur, was the most independent of the group. He had always been the first to rise in the mornings, pacing in restless circles until Emily noticed and started the day's routine. He was brave, too, always the first to try new foods and take tentative steps outside the cabin. But there was a wariness in his eyes that Emily could not ignore. It was as if the world had shown him too much cruelty, and now he doubted everything. Emily had to earn his trust in small ways, one day at a time. Odin was a gentle giant, or at least he would be once his body had fully healed. His thick coat of brown and black fur hid his frailty, and his deep brown eyes were full of both intelligence and sadness. Emily had seen a lot of dogs over the years, but Odin was different. It was as if he carried a weight far beyond the scars on his body. He was slow to trust, but whenever Emily approached, he seemed to soften. He would lean his head into her palm and accept the gentle strokes, as if remembering something deep within him. Something that felt both familiar and lost. Emily knew he needed time. Blaze was fiery and determined. The orange and black fur that covered his body had been singed in places, but now he seemed to be regaining his strength. Blaze had an energy about him that was infectious. He was always trying to nudge the others into action, even when they were too tired to move. Emily could see him in the mornings, dragging himself from his bed, looking to her for a sign of what to do next. And when she spoke to him, he wagged his tail, eager for the next step, whatever it might be. Luna was the quietest of the four. She had a sweetness to her, but it was tempered by the pain she carried. Her coat was thin, her ribs still visible under her fur, but her eyes were alive with curiosity. Every day, she seemed to grow stronger, and Emily noticed that Luna was starting to explore the cabin more, sniffing at corners she had once avoided. She was careful, though, each step deliberate, as though she didn't want to push herself too far, too fast. Luna was cautious, but willing to open up. She needed Emily's support, and Emily was more than willing to give it. Over the next few days, Emily continued her routine, treating the dogs' wounds, giving them food and water, and watching for signs of recovery. She had to take it slowly. Each dog had their own rhythm, their own pace of healing, and so did she. Emily wasn't just patching up their broken bodies. She was starting to piece together her own fragmented heart, bit by bit. By the end of the week, Emily realized it was time to give them names. At first, she had only thought of them as survivors, as victims of something far beyond their control. But now, as she watched them grow stronger each day, she could see the individuals they were becoming. She started with Scout. His boldness and independence were impossible to ignore, even if his past had left him scarred. "Scout," she said, and gently scratching behind his ears, "You were the first to make it out of that mess. You're a survivor." Next, she turned to Odin, the quiet giant. She had come to think of him as the protector of the group, the one who kept watch, even when he was exhausted. "Odin," she murmured, her fingers running through his thick coat, "you've got the heart of a king. You're strong, and you're going to be okay." Blaze was next. His fiery spirit couldn't be ignored, despite the odds he had fought to live. "Blaze," Emily whispered, her voice full of warmth, "you're like fire, burning bright, no matter what." Finally, Luna, the gentlest of them all, with eyes full of wonder and a heart still finding its way. "Luna," Emily said softly, brushing a lock of hair from her face as she looked at the dog. "You're like the moonlight, steady and calm, even when the world seems dark." As Emily spoke each name, the dogs responded. Scout perked up at his name, wagging his tail. Odin lifted his head, his eyes clear for the first time in days. Blaze seemed to take pride in his name, as if it were a badge of honor. And Luna, her delicate frame trembling, looked up at Emily with a quiet understanding, as if to say, "I trust you." Each name felt like a promise of healing, of hope, and of new beginnings. The next few days passed with a steady rhythm. Emily spent her mornings tending to the dogs, making sure they were well fed, hydrated, and as comfortable as possible. In the afternoons, she would take them outside, one by one, to walk around the cabin. It was slow progress, but it was progress nonetheless. Each day, the dogs seemed more willing to explore, more eager to trust her. And as the sun set each evening, Emily felt a growing sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in months, she didn't feel so lost. As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to realize that this wasn't just about saving the dogs anymore. It was about finding herself again, about rediscovering the strength she thought she had lost. These dogs needed her, but she also needed them. They were teaching her how to heal, how to love without reservation, how to trust again. It wasn't easy. Every day brought its challenges, but Emily was learning, just as the dogs were learning. The healing was mutual, quiet, slow, and steady. And as Emily sat on the cabin porch one evening, with the dogs resting beside her, she allowed herself to believe in the impossible. That perhaps just perhaps, she could start over, that there was more to life than loss and pain. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for all of them. Emily sat at her small, worn desk in the corner of the cabin, pen in hand. The dogs were curled up on their makeshift beds, breathing steadily, the rhythmic sound of their slumber providing an unexpected sense of peace. Her own thoughts, however, were far from calm. She hadn't written in weeks, not since before she left everything behind, not since the loss of her brother, not since the world had fallen apart. But now, with the dogs around her and a faint, steady warmth in the room, Emily felt a stirring inside her, a quiet urge to write again. She hadn't realized how much she missed the act of journaling, of putting her thoughts onto paper as though they could somehow become more manageable that way. The pen felt familiar in her fingers, almost like an old friend reaching out to her. As she started writing, the words flowed faster than she expected. She didn't have a plan, didn't know where this would go, but it felt right to write about the dogs, to process the overwhelming emotions she was experiencing. The past few days have been a blur. The dogs are improving, slowly but surely. Scout is beginning to act more like himself, less withdrawn. Odin, although still cautious, is showing signs of trust. Blaze's energy is returning. He's the first one up in the mornings, pushing at the door like he's ready to run. And Luna. Luna is the most fragile, but she's also the most resilient. There's something about her calm presence that soothes me in a way nothing else does. As she wrote, Emily could feel the connection between herself and the dogs deepening. There was a bond forming, unspoken, but undeniable. Their traumas mirrored her own. They had been broken, neglected, abandoned. Yet here they were, surviving, fighting. She had never believed in the idea of mutual healing until now. She had always thought that she had to fix things for others, to give her all to help them. But the dogs had shown her something she had forgotten. Healing was a two-way street. They had saved her just as much as she had saved them. Emily paused, her pen hovering over the page. She could see their faces now, Scout's cautious eyes, Odin's quiet wisdom, Blaze's fiery spirit, and Luna's gentle soul. Each of them had a story that was so much bigger than what she had seen in those first moments. They were more than just victims. They were survivors, and they had been through things that would leave scars. Scars that Emily understood far too well. It wasn't just the dogs that had been through trauma. She, too, was broken in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged. The loss of her brother was something she'd carried with her every single day. But it wasn't just the pain of his death that consumed her. It was the questions, the unanswered why. Why did he have to go? Why had he sacrificed everything for a cause that now seemed so distant? Emily wasn't sure how to live with that kind of loss. It felt like an open wound that never healed, no matter how hard she tried to move on. And now, here she was, alone in the woods, surrounded by animals who had experienced their own kind of trauma. They were all survivors, and perhaps that was what connected them. They all knew what it felt like to be left behind, to fight for their lives, to find a way to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. Emily found herself sitting in silence for a long time, her pen resting on the page. The dogs were asleep, and the world outside the cabin was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The stillness enveloped her, allowing her to reflect on the months she had spent running away from her grief. She had thought she was escaping the pain, but in truth she had been running toward something she hadn't yet realized. This cabin, these dogs, this new life. She was learning to heal, slowly but surely. The laughter that had been absent from her life for so long had started to return. She found herself laughing at little things when Odin would roll onto his back, belly up, hoping for belly rubs, When Blaze would steal a shoe and race around the cabin, tail wagging as if daring her to chase him. Even Luna, though quiet, would nudge her hand for affection, her eyes filled with trust. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when Emily felt at peace, moments when the weight of grief lifted just enough for her to breathe. It wasn't a permanent relief. She knew that. The grief would always be there, lurking, but it no longer consumed her the way it once had. And in these moments, Emily realized something else. Her brother's death had broken her, just as the dog's had been broken. But perhaps this was the key to healing, accepting the cracks, accepting that not everything could be fixed, that some things were meant to be carried, to be lived with, rather than erased. She was starting to accept the pain, to understand that it didn't have to define her. She didn't have to run anymore. As Emily closed her journal, she noticed Scout watching her from across the room. His dark eyes were fixed on her, alert but soft. She smiled at him, her heart swelling with a strange, unexpected emotion. She reached out a hand, and he trotted over, resting his head on her lap. Odin followed suit, curling up at her feet, while Blaze and Luna found their places beside her, forming a small, protective circle. For the first time in months, Emily felt truly connected, not just to the dogs, but to the world around her. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. The healing was mutual, quiet, and powerful. It was happening in small, seemingly insignificant moments. Like when Blaze finally stopped racing around and settled down beside her, or when Luna's tail wagged for the first time since they met. Each moment, each sign of progress, was like a piece of herself that had been lost and was now slowly being found. As the evening light faded and the stars began to twinkle above the cabin, Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She no longer felt alone. The dogs were here, she was here, and together they would continue to heal. The first time someone from the nearby town saw Emily walking the dogs down the dirt road, she hadn't expected anything to change. She had been keeping to herself, as usual, or venturing into the nearby woods for supplies and taking the dogs with her when she could. It was a quiet, slow existence, but Emily had grown used to the solitude. She had no desire to reconnect with the world, especially after everything that had happened. But the woman who stopped her that afternoon, standing at the edge of her property with a look of shock and curiosity, would change everything. Her name was Mary Thompson, and she was the town's retired schoolteacher. Her eyes, though friendly, were full of suspicion. It wasn't every day that someone walked into the remote town with a pack of German shepherds. Emily could tell that Mary had heard rumors of the dogs that had been found, but the woman's questions were cautious, probing. "How did they end up here?" Mary asked gently, but with an underlying edge of concern. "I didn't know anyone else lived out here." Emily hesitated for a moment, her fingers instinctively brushing through Blaze's fur as he walked beside her. There was something disarming about Mary's presence, something in her voice, her demeanor that softened Emily's reluctance to share. It was clear Mary wasn't just being nosy. She was concerned. "They were abandoned," Emily said, quietly, avoiding Mary's gaze. "Found them in the woods. They were poisoned, nearly dead." The woman's eyes widened, her expression shifting from curiosity to sympathy. Emily could tell that Mary's heart had just broken for the animals, and for her. There was something in the way the woman looked at her, something that spoke to the loneliness Emily hadn't fully acknowledged until now. "Poor things," Mary murmured. "And you're taking care of them all on your own?" Emily nodded, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to talking about it, wasn't sure she was ready for anyone to fully understand what had been going on in her life since she found the dogs. But the kindness in Mary's eyes made her feel as though there was no judgment, only genuine care. "I'm managing," Emily said finally, her voice soft. It's just been a lot to handle." Mary seemed to understand, but she didn't press. Instead, she offered a warm smile, one that made Emily feel a little lighter. "Well," Mary said, If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I'm just up the road." Emily thanked her, still unsure of what the interaction meant, but something in Mary's words stayed with her long after they parted ways. She had never been one to accept help. It felt like admitting weakness, but Mary's offer lingered in her mind, and it was then that Emily realized something. The dogs weren't the only ones who needed help. She needed help too. Over the next few days, word spread quickly through the small town. Emily couldn't quite pinpoint when it happened, but by the end of the week, people were starting to show up at her cabin. At first, it was small things. A box of dog food dropped off at her front door by a couple who lived down the road. A few blankets and old towels left by a retired farmer, along with a note that read, "For the dogs, good luck." Each act of kindness was small, but it added up in ways that Emily hadn't expected. A few days later, a man named George Turner, a retired veterinarian, stopped by. His gray hair and wrinkled face told of years of experience, and his eyes were sharp with the kind of knowing that only time could offer. "I heard about what you're doing here," George said as they sat together on the cabin porch, sipping coffee. "You've done well so far, but I can help. I've seen a lot of injuries, a lot of poisonings, in my time." Emily was surprised by his offer, but she didn't hesitate. She had always worked alone, relying on her own knowledge. But the weight of the responsibility was beginning to feel too heavy. It felt like a relief to know there was someone who could help guide her through the more complicated aspects of the dog's recovery. "I could use your help," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure I can do it all on my own." George smiled, as though he had been waiting for her to say those words. "It's hard, I know, but it's better when you don't have to do it alone." For the next few weeks, George became a regular presence at the cabin. He taught Emily things she hadn't known, how to properly mix medical solutions, how to assess a dog's long-term health risks, how to monitor their physical and emotional recovery. Emily was a fast learner, but there was a quiet humility in her that made her receptive to guidance. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew George was helping to fill the gaps where her knowledge had been lacking. The town began to show more interest as well. One afternoon, a local school teacher named Susan dropped by with a group of her students. They were eager to meet the dogs and offer what they could. Emily watched as the children, most of them no older than 8 or 9, knelt down to pet the dogs, their faces lighting up with joy as the animals responded. "These dogs are incredible," one of the boys said, his eyes wide with wonder. "They've been through so much, but they're still so friendly." Emily could see that the children had formed an unspoken bond with the dogs, too. It was the first time in a long while that she had seen children interact with the animals without fear or hesitation. They understood what Emily had only recently realized. These dogs weren't just victims. They were survivors, and they had strength beyond what anyone could imagine. The visits continued, each one bringing something new. Food donations, supplies, and even emotional support began flooding in. Emily could feel the town's quiet acceptance, and although she was still reserved, she started to welcome the involvement. It was strange at first, this growing community of strangers who were now invested in the dog's recovery. But with each new person who reached out, the burden on Emily's shoulders lightened. In the evenings, when Emily sat on the porch with the dogs, she found herself looking out over the fields with a new sense of hope. The healing wasn't just happening for the dogs, it was happening for her, too. The weight of isolation had begun to lift, replaced by a quiet but undeniable sense of connection. And as she listened to the sounds of the dogs, still recovering but growing stronger each day, Emily realized something profound. Sometimes, the most unexpected gifts come not from what we do alone, but from the people we allow into our lives. The small town of Hollow Creek had always been peaceful, nestled between thick forests and rugged hills that seemed to stand as sentinels over the lives of those who lived there. But since Emily had moved in, her life had become anything but peaceful. The dogs, Scout, Odin, Blaze, and Luna were thriving under her care, and the kindness of the townspeople had slowly begun to chip away at the wall she had built around herself. Yet, a nagging feeling still gnawed at her, something that refused to be ignored. There was no way the dogs had ended up in the woods on their own. Someone had left them there, someone had poisoned them, and someone had deliberately hurt them. Emily's instincts, honed from her brief but intense training in veterinary school, told her this was no accident. The dogs hadn't simply wandered away from a farm or a house. They had been deliberately discarded, left to suffer and die. It was a cold morning when the thought crossed her mind. She had been tending to the dogs, giving them their morning medications, when she noticed something that made her stomach drop. A faint smell of diesel oil mixed with the sour, metallic scent of something else, something that didn't belong. It was coming from the far side of her property, just beyond the tree line where the land started to slope down toward a dilapidated barn. Emily had seen the barn before, but it had always seemed so distant, so out of place that she had never thought to explore it. Now, something about the place seemed to call to her, as if it were whispering a truth that she wasn't yet ready to face. The barn, it had clearly been abandoned for years. The roof sagged in places, the wood of the walls rotted and cracked, and the rusted remains of old farming equipment lay scattered around the yard. Emily had always assumed it was just a relic of a time long gone, a reminder of how the town had once been more self-sufficient. But now, as she stood at the edge of her property, staring at the barn in the distance, something felt wrong. It was as though the barn had secrets hidden beneath its decaying wood. Her curiosity, once suppressed by grief, began to spark again. She had to know what was there. She had to find out if the place had anything to do with the dogs. After grabbing her coat and a flashlight, Emily made her way toward the barn, each step purposeful but hesitant. The ground was muddy from the rain earlier in the week, and the trees closed in around her, making her feel as though the world had shrunk to just this one place. The barn loomed ahead, its broken windows casting long shadows across the yard. As she drew closer, the smell grew stronger, and Emily's heart began to race. She had never been particularly frightened by the woods, but this place felt different. It felt, wrong. She approached the barn cautiously, trying not to make a sound. The door was hanging loosely on its hinges, barely attached to the frame. She pushed it open slowly, the creak of the old wood sending a shiver down her spine. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the stench of decay. There were remnants of old farm equipment scattered on the floor, along with broken crates and rusted tools. But what caught Emily's eye immediately were the bloodstains on the wooden floor. Her breath caught in her throat as she knelt down to examine the marks. They were fresh. Well, were too fresh to have been there for long. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just an old barn left to rot. This was the site of something dark, something sinister. Emily stood up, her mind racing. She turned to look around the barn, searching for more clues. As she moved toward the far corner, her flashlight beam fell upon something even more disturbing, a set of cages. There were several of them, stacked in rows, each one small and cramped. The cages were empty now, but it didn't take much imagination to picture what had once been inside them. Dogs, trapped and terrified, just like the ones she had found in the woods. Her hands trembled as she approached one of the cages. Its metal bars bent and broken. She crouched down and examined the ground around it, finding more signs of abuse. Broken chains, remnants of dried blood, and even a few scraps of old, torn fabric that looked like dog collars. Emily's stomach churned. This was where the dogs had come from. The barn had been a place of suffering, a place where animals had been abused and discarded. And now, Emily had proof of a crime, and proof that whoever had done this was still out there. Her mind raced as she took out her phone, snapping pictures of the cages and the bloodstains, making sure to capture everything in detail. She knew she couldn't solve this on her own. She needed help. But who could she turn to? The local authorities had always been helpful in small ways, but this was something far bigger, something far darker than she had anticipated. Emily stood up, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had to report this. She had to make sure the people responsible for this abuse were held accountable. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. She didn't know who she could trust or how far this went. The thought that someone in this secondal town could be responsible for the suffering of the dogs, someone who could have been living quietly among them, filled her with dread. As she walked back to her cabin, the images of the cages and the bloodstains burned in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whoever had done this was out there watching. And Emily knew that if she didn't act soon, the pain and suffering the dogs had endured would continue to haunt the town. She had to take action. She had to stop this before it was too late. The days that followed were filled with tension. Emily had made up her mind. She could no longer keep quiet about what she had found in the barn. The evidence was undeniable, and the truth was staring her in the face. The animals, the cages, the bloodstains. It was all connected, and Emily knew she had to bring this to light, no matter the cost. Her first step was to contact the local authorities. She had been hesitant at first. Small towns like Hollow Creek didn't always welcome outsiders or confront uncomfortable truths. But she couldn't do this on her own. She couldn't be the one to investigate further. She needed help. The sheriff's office was a modest building on the edge of town. When Emily walked in, she felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. The man behind the desk, Sheriff Dean, looked up from his paperwork with a weary smile. He was an older man, his face weathered by years of service, but his eyes were sharp. "Can I help you, Miss Hayes?" he asked, his voice steady and kind, though his eyes scanned the room as if weighing her words. Emily hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision heavy on her chest. She had already gathered the evidence, but the fear of what might come next gnawed at her. Would they believe her? Would they take her seriously? Or would she become the target of suspicion herself, accused of stirring up trouble in a town that was, for the most part, content in its ignorance? "I need to report something," Emily said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I found something in the woods just beyond my property. It's a barn. And there are cages, old cages, probably used to house animals. I found bloodstains, and I think it was used as a place for illegal dog fighting and breeding." Now, Sheriff Dean's expression shifted instantly from casual curiosity to one of concern. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he listened intently. "Dog fighting?" he asked, his tone more serious now. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded, pulling out her phone and showing him the photos she had taken. The images were graphic, the cages stained with remnants of blood, the broken chains, and the empty dog collars. Sheriff Dean studied the pictures for a long moment before looking up at her. Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I can show you," Emily replied, the words coming out with a mixture of urgency and dread. "I can take you there?" After a brief pause, Sheriff Dean stood up, his chair creaking beneath him. He grabbed his jacket, throwing it over his shoulders. "All right, Miss Hayes. I'll grab a couple of officers and meet you at your cabin. We'll go from there." Emily's heart raced as they walked out of the sheriff's office together. She could feel the weight of the moment settle in her chest, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead felt suffocating. Would they find more evidence? Would they be able to uncover the full extent of what had happened in that barn? And most of all, would they be able to stop whoever was responsible for this before more animals were harmed? When they reached the barn, Sheriff Dean took one look at the dilapidated structure and nodded. "This is it," he murmured. "We've had reports of illegal activities around here before, but nothing concrete. It's a quiet area. But this is bad." Emily led them inside, her heart pounding as she watched the sheriff and his deputies examine the barn. They were methodical, scanning the area with practiced eyes. The bloodstains on the floor were undeniable, and the cages, though empty, spoke volumes. As the sheriff walked further into the barn, his boots crunching on the dusty floor, his expression darkened. "I've seen this before," Sheriff Dean said, his voice heavy with a mix of frustration and disgust. "The signs of a breeding and fighting ring. It's a business to some people. Sickening, but it's true." He turned back to Emily, his eyes hard. "Whoever did this, they're not just random criminals. This is organized. We're dealing with something much bigger." Emily nodded, her hands shaking as she took in the weight of his words. "What can we do? How do we stop them?" "We'll need more evidence," Sheriff Dean replied. "The local authorities can't just raid a place without solid proof. I'll need your help to gather everything. Any more photos, any details you can remember about the barn. We'll take it from there." As the officers continued to gather evidence, Emily's mind raced. She thought back to the first time she had found the dogs, sick and barely clinging to life. How had they ended up in the woods, abandoned to suffer and die? And why hadn't anyone in the town noticed the strange activity at the barn before? There were too many questions, too many pieces to the puzzle, and that still didn't fit. But as they worked, a breakthrough came. One of the deputies, a younger officer named Ben, approached Sheriff Dean with a small file in his hands. "Sheriff, you might want to see this." Ben handed the file over, and Emily's heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the top of the page. It was a name she recognized from the town, a name that had once been whispered about in hushed tones during her brief time here. The man was a local businessman, known for his involvement in shady dealings. He had always been a figure on the periphery of town gossip, but Emily had never thought much of it. Now it seemed he was at the center of something far darker than anyone had imagined. "Jack Foster," Sheriff Dean muttered, his voice low. "I should have known. He's been linked to underground operations before, but nothing concrete." Emily felt a surge of fear and anger. "Do you think he's behind this? Do you think he's the one who—" "Unfortunately, yes," Sheriff Dean interrupted, "but this isn't going to be easy. We'll need to build a case. We need more than in just a few photos and some broken cages. We'll need a witness, someone who can testify to the operation." Emily's stomach sank. A witness. She thought back to the whistleblower tip she had received earlier, a nameless voice over the phone who had hinted at the truth. The pieces were falling into place, and Emily knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The days that followed the sheriff's investigation were a blur of paperwork, interviews, and mounting pressure. Emily had become more than just a rescuer of dogs. Now, she was part of something much larger, something that was going to change her life and the lives of so many others. The authorities had gathered enough evidence to issue a warrant for Jack Foster's property, and the raid was set in motion. With the sheriff and his team leading the way, Emily felt a mix of emotions: fear, hope, anger, but most of all, a deep sense of determination. When the operation went down, it was a triumph for the small town of Hollow Creek. They found more dogs, more evidence, and more horrors hidden in the depths of Foster's property than anyone had imagined. The illegal breeding ring had been operating for years, carefully concealed behind layers of deception and bribery. The evidence they collected was enough to shut down the operation for good. Jack Foster was arrested and charged with animal cruelty, illegal breeding, and running an underground dog fighting operation. The community, once skeptical of Emily and her dogs, began to look at her in a new light. She wasn't just a woman running away from her past. She was a hero, someone who had single-handedly uncovered a dark secret that had been festering right under their noses. People began to visit more frequently, not just to offer donations, but to offer support. Some people even wanted to help rehabilitate the dogs and provide a better life for the animals that had been saved. Emily knew, however, that the work was far from over. As the sheriff and his deputies worked tirelessly to dismantle the criminal operation, Emily realized that she could not go back to her solitary existence. She had seen firsthand the power of community, and she had learned that sometimes healing didn't happen in isolation. It happened when people came together with a shared goal, a shared sense of purpose. One day, as she sat on the porch of her cabin with Scout's head resting on her lap, Emily began to feel a shift inside herself. The dogs had made progress, each of them growing stronger, more playful, and more trusting. Odin had gained back much of his weight, and his once somber eyes now sparkled with joy. Blaze had turned into a playful troublemaker, always nudging the other dogs into games of chase and tug-of-war. Luna, though still quiet, was becoming more curious, more interactive. But it was Scout who had truly come into his own. The once wary dog had begun to open up, his confidence growing with each passing day. It wasn't just the dogs who were healing, and it was Emily too. With the weight of the investigation behind her, and the knowledge that she had helped bring justice to the dogs who had suffered, Emily began to see the world through new eyes. The loss of her brother, the pain she had carried for so long, was still there, but it no longer consumed her. She had found a new purpose, one that gave her life meaning again. One afternoon, while taking the dogs for a walk, Emily met with George Turner, the retired veterinarian who had helped her during the recovery process. George had been instrumental in educating her about animal care and offering guidance. They had become good friends, and Emily was grateful for his mentorship. George had been talking about the idea of expanding her efforts, turning the cabin into a true rescue center, a sanctuary for animals in need. "You know," George said as they walked side by side, "this place has potential, Emily. You've got the space, the drive, and the support of the community. You could turn this into something much bigger, a place where animals like those dogs can get the care they deserve, and maybe even help people along the way." Emily stopped walking, her mind racing with the idea. She'd always dreamed of working with animals, but the idea of running a sanctuary, of offering a place where abused animals could heal, was something she hadn't considered before. Her cabin had been a haven for a handful of dogs, but it could be so much more. "What if we could make it official?" Emily said, a spark of excitement in her voice. "What if we could create a sanctuary, a place where people could bring animals in need, where we could rehabilitate them and give them, a second chance at life?" George smiled, his eyes twinkling with approval. "I think that's a great idea, Emily. You've got the heart for it, and you've already proven that you can make a difference." The thought of transforming her small cabin into a full-fledged rescue center filled her with both excitement and fear. Could she really take on such a big responsibility? But as she looked at the dogs running ahead, tails wagging, she knew deep down that she could. She had found her purpose, not just saving the animals, but helping them heal and find new homes, and in turn, helping people who needed the healing just as much. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning. Emily applied for a state grant, and with the help of the town's support, she secured the funds needed to expand the cabin and build proper kennels, treatment rooms, and a training area for the dogs. The community rallied around her, offering donations, volunteer hours, and services. Local businesses pitched in, and the once isolated woman who had moved into the cabin to escape her grief had become a symbol of hope for Hollow Creek. As the sanctuary began to take shape, Emily realized just how much her life had changed. The work was hard, and the days were long, but the rewards were immeasurable. Each day, she watched as the dogs grew stronger, more confident, and more trusting. And slowly, the sanctuary began to welcome new animals in need, dogs rescued from shelters, stray animals in desperate need of care, and even horses and other livestock that had been abandoned or mistreated. But Emily was not just helping animals, she was helping people, too. One afternoon, a man named Tom, a local war veteran suffering from PTSD, came to the sanctuary. He had heard about the work Emily was doing and wanted to volunteer. He began walking and training the dogs, and as he spent time with them, he began to open up about his struggles. Over time, he formed an unspoken bond with Odin, and slowly, Tom began to heal too. And as Emily watched the transformation in Tom, she realized that the sanctuary was more than just a place for animals to recover. It was a place where people could find healing as well. The connection between the dogs and the veterans, the children, the families, each bond was a reminder that healing was a process, and it wasn't something that could be done alone. It was a shared experience, one that brought people together. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Emily sat on the porch of the sanctuary with Scout's head resting on her lap, watching the dogs play in the yard. The sanctuary had become everything she had ever hoped for, and more. The pain of her past still lingered, but it no longer defined her. She had found a new purpose, a new family, and in the process, had discovered the power of community and compassion. And as Emily looked out over the land that had once felt like a prison, she realized that she was exactly where she was meant to be. It had been 6 months since Emily had started transforming her small cabin into the Hollow Creek Sanctuary, and each day brought with it new challenges and triumphs. The sanctuary had grown far beyond what she could have imagined when she first arrived in the remote town, searching for solace in the wilderness. Now, it was alive with the sounds of barking dogs, the laughter of children, and the footsteps of volunteers working to make a difference. The once silent cabin was now a place of constant movement. The newly constructed kennels were filled with animals from all walks of life, dogs with sad eyes, horses with broken spirits, and even a few rescued rabbits and cats. Each one of them carried a story, and each story was one of survival. Emily could see their pain reflected in their eyes, but she also saw something else: hope. It wasn't just the animals that were healing, it was the people, too. One of the most unexpected developments in the sanctuary was the increasing number of veterans who started volunteering. They had heard about the work Emily was doing and wanted to be a part of it. The connection between the dogs and the veterans was instantaneous. Many of the soldiers suffering from PTSD found solace in the dogs' calm, unwavering presence. They saw themselves in the eyes of the animals, their pain, their struggles, their silent strength. And the dogs, in turn, began to trust again, just as the veterans did. Tom, the war veteran who had first come to the sanctuary, was now one of the most dedicated volunteers. He had found peace in the companionship of Odin, and slowly, his struggles with anxiety and nightmares began to fade. He was no longer isolated in his grief. He was part of something larger than himself, a community of people and animals helping each other heal. Emily watched as Tom and Odin worked together, training and walking the dogs. The bond between them had grown deeper than Emily could have imagined. Tom, once a man who rarely spoke of his past, now shared his story with others, using his journey to help others who had been through similar struggles. The sanctuary had become more than just a place for rescue animals. It had become a place for people to find redemption. It wasn't just the veterans who were finding healing. Children with anxiety and autism also found comfort in the dogs, especially the older, calmer ones who had already been through their own healing process. The bond between the children and the animals was undeniable. Emily had watched a young boy named Jacob, who had been withdrawn and terrified of the outside world, slowly open up as he spent time with Blaze. The once ferocious dog had become a gentle companion to Jacob, and over time, the boy's fear of the world around him began to dissipate. One afternoon, Emily sat on the porch of the sanctuary, watching as the dogs played in the yard, running and chasing each other in the warm sunlight. The yard had been carefully designed to give the animals the space they needed to run, play, and socialize. There were benches for visitors, shaded areas for the dogs to rest, and even a small pond where they could cool off during the summer months. The sight of the animals running freely, their tails wagging, was a reminder of how far they had come. Just a few months ago, they had been broken, poisoned, and abandoned. Now they were healthy, strong, and surrounded by a community that cared for them. Emily had given them a second chance at life, and in return, they had given her a new sense of purpose. But there was still so much work to be done. Emily knew that the sanctuary was still in its early stages, and there were many obstacles to overcome. Funding was always a challenge, and there were times when Emily worried about the sustainability of the project. The town had been supportive, but it wasn't always easy to get the resources needed to run such a large operation. Emily had learned to be resourceful, relying on donations, volunteer labor, and community partnerships to keep the sanctuary going. Despite the challenges, the sanctuary was growing. Emily had started to expand the volunteer network, bringing in more people from the town to help with the day-to-day operations. Local businesses had also begun to support the sanctuary, donating food, supplies, and even offering services like veterinary care and construction work. It was a community effort, and Emily couldn't have done it alone. As the sanctuary grew, so did Emily's confidence in herself and her abilities. She had spent so many years running from her grief, hiding in isolation, but now she was building something real, something that was making a tangible difference in the world. She had found her place in the world again, not just as a caretaker for animals, but as a leader in a community that was united by compassion and love. One evening, after a long day of work, Emily sat down with Tom and George on the porch. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with hues of purple and pink as the sun set behind the hills. The sounds of the dogs playing and barking in the background were comforting, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt at peace. "You know," George said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd see the day when this place would become a sanctuary. Not just for the animals, but for the people, too." Emily smiled, looking out at the yard filled with the dogs and volunteers. "I never thought I'd be here either," she said softly, "but I'm glad I am." Tom nodded in agreement. "You've built something amazing here, Emily. You've given these animals a second chance at life, and you've given us a chance to heal too." Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at the people and animals around her. It wasn't just the dogs who had found a new lease on life. It was the people, too, and it was all happening here, at Hollow Creek Sanctuary, a place where healing was not just a possibility, but a reality. She had found her purpose. And it wasn't just about rescuing animals. It was about rebuilding lives, her own, the dogs, and the people who had found solace in this place. Emily had come to realize that sometimes the most unexpected healing came from helping others. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days at Hollow Creek Sanctuary had settled into a rhythm that Emily had never known before. It wasn't just the animals that were healing, it was the people too. As the sanctuary flourished, it became a beacon for more than just the broken dogs who had found their way to her doorstep. It was a place where individuals, each one carrying their own burdens, could find solace in the quiet companionship of the animals, and in the warmth of a community that truly cared. As the days grew warmer, and the spring blossoms began to color the hills in shades of pink and purple, Emily found herself sitting outside on the porch one evening, the golden light of the setting sun spilling across the sanctuary's yard. The dogs were playing in the distance, Scout and Blaze darting through the grass, Odin watching over them with his usual calm demeanor, and Luna sitting quietly, enjoying the warmth of the day. The entire scene was peaceful, serene, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt truly at peace with herself. She had come so far in her journey. It had been more than a year since she had first stumbled upon the dogs in the woods, broken and abandoned. She remembered the fear and uncertainty that had clouded her mind back then. She'd been a woman running from grief, from loss, from the death of her brother, from the weight of a future that seemed hopeless. And yet, she had found her way, not by running, but by staying. Staying to fight for something bigger than herself, something that had the power to heal not only the animals she had saved, but herself as well. The sanctuary had become her second chance, just as it had become a second chance for the dogs. The love and care she had poured into each of them had started to fill the empty spaces in her own heart. Emily had learned that healing wasn't something you could rush. It It was a slow, steady process, and sometimes it took time to realize that you had healed it all. As she sat on the porch, a scout trotted over to her, his head nuzzling her hand. She smiled, scratching behind his ears. The bond they shared had deepened over the months. Scout had come to trust her, and she had learned to trust him in return. His once wary eyes now held a quiet strength. He had been the first to show signs of life in the woods, and now he was the first to show signs of hope in her heart. "You're not so bad, are you?" Emily whispered to him, her voice soft as she gently stroked his fur. "I think you might have saved me, too." The bond between Emily and the dogs was undeniable. She had watched them grow from frightened, poisoned animals into strong, vibrant beings, each one with their own personality, their own quirks, and their own capacity for love. But it wasn't just the dogs who had changed. Emily had transformed as well. The woman who had once walked alone, burdened by grief, had become someone who now led, who cared, who built something from the ground up. She wasn't just running a sanctuary for animals anymore. She was running a place where people found healing, where veterans like Tom had discovered peace, where children like Jacob had found their voice, and where people, like herself, had rediscovered their own strength. It was a place where everyone, animal and human alike, had the chance to rebuild what had once been broken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily looked across the yard and saw the children of the town laughing and running with the dogs. The sanctuary had become a place of joy, not just healing. It had become a symbol of hope for the entire community. A gentle breeze brushed across her face, and for a moment Emily closed her eyes, allowing herself to take it all in. The laughter, the barking of the dogs, the warmth of the sun on her skin, and it was all so simple, yet so powerful. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a place in the world. Not as a survivor of grief, but as someone who had helped create something meaningful. Her thoughts were interrupted by Tom, who came over and sat beside her on the porch, a quiet smile on his face. He'd been with her from the beginning, the first volunteer at the sanctuary, the first person to truly understand the impact this place had on those who came here. He had seen the change in Emily, just as she had seen it in him. And the connection between them was something neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. "You know," Tom said, his voice low and steady, "this place is more than just a sanctuary for the animals. It's a sanctuary for all of us?" Emily nodded, looking over at him. "I never expected it to be like this. I thought it was just about saving them. But now, I see it's about saving all of us." Tom smiled, his eyes filled with understanding. "Sometimes we don't realize that we need saving, too." Emily looked around at the sanctuary, at the dogs, at the children playing with them, at the volunteers who had become like family, and she felt something stir within her, a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, for the people and animals who had helped her heal, and for the community that had embraced her, despite her hesitation. "You're right," Emily said softly. "This place, it's healing for all of us." And as the last light of the sun faded from the sky, Emily felt the weight of her past slip away. She had found her purpose, and she had found a family. One that was built not on blood, but on love, compassion, and shared healing. The sanctuary was more than just a place for animals. It was a place where lives were transformed, where hearts were mended, and where the power of compassion created a ripple effect that reached far beyond its gates. Emily leaned back in her chair, watching the dogs and the people she had come to love. She knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be more animals to rescue, more lives to touch, more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, she was content. She had found a place where she belonged, a place where healing was more than just a process. It was a way of life. And sometimes the things left behind are just waiting for someone strong enough to believe they're worth saving. Emily thought, her eyes closing as she let the night settle in around her. She smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning,